So this is a preface, so to speak, to the discussion of how you can jump a judge's order from one state to another and do it legally. And it's not about me. I'm not talking necessarily about me jumping the order, although I think it would be certainly appropriate to say that's what I did. On the other hand, the the interest I have is I've been often wondering whether or not you would have any legal precedent to jump from one state to another in a clean way and do it with some degree of legal credibility, which would lead you to become the ABA Lawyer of the Year, which in the case of Mike Moore is the exact thing that happened. Now, I am leading up to a slight story of indifference to the law, not necessarily by myself, but also, or including myself. And for that, I have to give you a setting. It is my theory, which began to develop slowly, but I began to see it, first of all, from the perspective of the press, the coverage, and over a period of time, I realized that somebody was scripting something. And from the September issues of September of actually was September of 1993. I didn't lose interest in Kentucky, and I certainly had to maintain my interest in the lawsuit. So there was a insufferable amount of indignity that had to be endured, and it seemed to me that there was a scripting going on behind the scenes, starting in perhaps when I received the first lawsuit in Mississippi, having to deal with my name on the lawsuit. My name is the first name, and I would see that in February of '95. But before I got to that level, I realized that this was not about me so much as it was about the John Does. And so in the processing of how to make things clean, so to speak, I was in the middle of people who were really dirty. I mean, there was no question about it that there was a lot of compromise, if you want to call it compromise, down from Barrett, who was sneakily lifting things and sending them off to California, and to Stan Glantz, who has endured these years and made a reputation for himself through his help with Don Barrett, who admits that unbeknownst to me, and unbeknownst to the time that I had custody of these documents that had been purloined, I wondered how much dirt there was about how dirty I was and how dirty the others were, if there was any dirt. And then for elected officials, I was nonplussed by some of the some of those people who formed a family, a unit, under an impressive name called HALT, H-A-L-T, which was called the Health Advocates litigation team. Now, in that team, there was Mike Moore, and Scruggs was the non-official, but they had worked in a way where they could actually become appointees through the legislature, actually legal commission, so to speak, as if you are a lieutenant in a mafia organization. And this was, again, sneakily applied into the law, slipped into, as we often see in Washington. What is not perplexing is the members who became part of this. I certainly didn't know anything about that, nor was I supposed to. And then there was a subgroup, aside from Moore and the obvious Scruggs, Barrett, the fellow who had somehow created the illusion of the amorphous plaintiff and the Medicaid lawsuits. There had some history on this fellow Lewis and his theory, yet nevertheless, he appears in the same group at HALT as does Ness Motley, and Motley is something of a very, very complex character in a way. I had never met him, and he's sort of like the fellow who is named David Nutt, I think is the guy who gets $500 million for putting in $2.5 million and supporting Dick Scruggs. That's not a bad deal, really, when you think about it. On the other hand, what I feel in terms of a little bit of taint is that I took more of the lack of being absolutely clean than I deserved. Maybe it's time, perhaps, to show that others, and I'm doing that basically. Others had this what we call clean hands, and one of those is Mike Moore. And the clean hands theory is that if you actually get your hands dirty in a lawsuit, or you're involved with the wrong people, it's difficult to explain. And there were so many of these people that I didn't know. I had no idea. But I was the leper, so to speak. And the one thing that made this leprosy so contagious to me, for me, was the fact that I came from Kentucky with the history of everything. And everything begins with, as I say, it begins before any kind of activity. It starts in 1992, and it actually starts in 1988. Because I didn't do this because I felt like it was going to end up in such a way where basic to everything is the transference of wealth. The transfer of wealth from the tobacco companies down to the lawyers, the arbitrators, the health advocates, the people who really had done nothing. If anything, it was more or less to decide who got what and how much. And so where you are not confused at all, where I was not confused at all, and toward the end had to really fight to maintain my own status as being somewhat the maverick, but Nevertheless, I wasn't going to be completely devoured, so to speak. It went on to the very last part. On the front, where you see Mississippi's case against big tobacco, there was I was the stalking horse for Jeffrey Wigand, no question about that. I think there's no question also that he would not probably have gone out on his own if there had not been that lawsuit, which had been perpetuated by what we anticipated in terms of the summer of 93 and the spring as well, because that's when we strategized it. We were waiting for them, and either they were going to sue us or they weren't. So everything goes back to Kentucky, and I spent the entire 4 years going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So sandwiched between Brown and Williamson versus Merrill Williams and M&S Enterprises and John Doe's 1 through 10, and the unknown defendant, which actually was Maddox versus Williams. It boiled down to you were in the middle of something where, I mean, greed in terms of people and your leprosy. The concept of being in the middle of this was perpetuated in the form of a screenplay, and it wasn't the one that turned out to be the Michael Mann film. This was an entirely different one. Although, to be absolutely honest, there was a crossover between the man who had the grip, so to speak, on this, and that was Lowell Bergman. And as an actor with a history, I almost want to say I could feel the spirit in the room whenever Lowell Bergman happened to come around, and Lowell Bergman was the person who was pursuing his own initiatives, and not only certainly as the spokesperson, so to speak, for Frontline, which is a PBS program. But he followed this and led this in a way that it was going to contribute to his own offerings. And what is confusing less and less is as I become less and less of a stalking horse, and it focuses more on other people. It's still the same way. Louisville, Kentucky, and the way this started is not a focus except for the tobacco companies. And if you have a chance to really get into this, you realize that since it started there and it's picked up under a totally different concept, well, they're different, but they still have to have something behind them. So when I actually get to the point where I'm meeting some of these people from Halt, Don Barrett, who is so famously generous in his personal well-being and his attitude and his Christian devotion, is a person that you trust. And since you trust him, what is there wrong? So when I go in, and eventually this reaches Mike Moore. Mike Moore is Attorney General, elected office. And we end up eventually in a bank building, which is owned by Dick Scruggs. And when we end up with that bank building, that's supposed to be mine. I'm supposed to be the person who has the custody. So that's what I want to run down and talk about, because essentially from the moment this gets out of my hands, I become persona non grata, and Kentucky becomes totally lost. And yet it's where it began. So in the next one, I'm going to talk about Mike Moore.